I'm Curator of Education, Anna Smith, and today it's my pleasure to introduce our January 360 guest, artist Melvin Edwards. We at the Nasher are exceptionally proud to be the site of artist Melvin Edwards' first retrospective in more than 20 years. Best known for his seminal Lynch Fragments, an ongoing series of small-scale reliefs born out of the social and political turmoil of the civil rights movement, Edwards' welded sculpture provides a critical bridge between modernist techniques and contemporary approaches to the object. Edwards has been widely exhibited since the mid-1960s and is represented in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Brooklyn Museum of Art. His work has recently been included in exhibitions at the Brooklyn Museum, the Whitney, the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, MoMA PS1, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and the Hammer. Edwards taught at Rutgers University from 1972 to 2002, and in 2014 received an honorary doctorate from the Massachusetts College of Art, Boston. Organized by Associate Curator Catherine Craft, the Nasher exhibition brings together the Lynch Fragments with other bodies of Edwards' welded sculpture and recreates the groundbreaking installation of 4 barbed wire sculptures originally shown at the Whitney in 1970. Craft is the author of An Audience of Artists, Dada, Neo-Dada, and the Emergence of Abstract Art, and Robert Rauschenberg, as well as numerous articles and reviews. Her essay on Edwards' work and an interview with the artist are available as part of the scholarly catalog, Melvin Edwards, 5 Decades. I look forward now to a rich and engaging conversation between the two of them, so please join me in welcoming Melvin Edwards and Catherine Craft.
50 years of work. You ready?
We'll do it real quick, and that way we can have a drink.
That's a good incentive.
Okay.
For people who may not be so familiar with your work, I mean, for us, this is sort of an end and a beginning. First public day of the exhibition being open. You grew up in Houston and partly Dayton, Ohio for a few years. And as I understand, you were interested in art, but mainly drawing and painting all along. You went to Los Angeles to go to college, where you majored in art and played football. And but concentrate. Well, that's important, and we may get to that. The football and the sculpture is important.
I thought it was that was important. But okay.
That too. We'll get to that too. But I think I might want to start by asking you how it was that you started making sculpture, or decided that sculpture was maybe more suitable for what you wanted to express as an artist when you'd been involved with painting for really up until that point.
The evolution was sort of, I'd been in college from 1955 to about 1959 and was still there, but I saw a couple of graduate students welding. In those days, your training was that you took a variety of things, not knowing what you'd concentrate on unless you just felt, a certain way. And I had taken a couple of required sculpture classes, and they were fine, but it wasn't my particular interest. But I saw a couple of graduate students welding, and that process fascinated me a bit. So I took a night class from one of the two to learn the process. There wasn't any teaching in that situation in relation to what the work should look like, but just whether you could structurally put 2 pieces of steel together, which in the long run is the most important thing anyway, in the sense that the work can be agreeable, disagreeable, a success or a failure, but it can't fall down, because then you don't have any reputation. But the truth is, I already was evolving ideas of how to work, or what ways were best for me to express. And I had evolved through ideas that focused on abstraction as a process, as a concept, not as stylistically, though the concept ultimately produced stylistically abstract work. So when I got to welding as a way of doing things, and the sculptural focus on 3 dimensions, which is the primary difference between painting and sculpture. I had instinctive or limited experience which allowed me or pointed out ways for me to go. I had a bit of what you'd call a philosophical disagreement with the art world's rhetoric of the period, which was art for art's sake, meaning or implying that you shouldn't have any content in the work that was political or social or anything like that. And, I knew from my own true reading of history, art history in particular, that people all over the world had made art for every reason under the sun, and people had invented art, literature, and everything else from many, many points of view. So why should I have to take one out? Especially as I was living in a society that's very complex, comprehensive, and needed a lot of change, and I was, had feelings about those things. So I should be able to put it in my work. I didn't want to do it, however, in ways that other artists had, that came before me, you could say. I wanted to invent newer or different expressive ways or expressive ways that were my own. You might say the validity of my own voice. And of course, I'm paraphrasing a poem of my late wife, Jane Cortez, who had a poem that said basically, find your own voice and use it, use your own voice and find it, meaning find out what you need to know to express whatever you need to express. And everybody's voice in this room is unique to them, and that's all. But they're all valid from that point of view. Now, whether they're making good art with it or not, that's another issue, And the same thing about me finding my way in art, even though I had what I'd call a sound philosophical base, it didn't mean that the work that I did might be significant. I hope that it would be, and I worked on the ideas that you see here in this exhibition.
Well, just to, I think that's a great introduction to these works, the earliest works in the exhibition. 3 works made in 1963 after you'd been experimenting with welding for about 3 years. The work on the left, Some Bright Morning, became the first of a series that you've stopped making at points, but you've made more or less throughout your artistic life since then, a body of work that you called Lynch Fragments. Can you talk a little bit about especially where that first work came from and how you felt this could be an ongoing way of making work?
Sure. In experimenting with steel and or sculpture and in small scale, picking a group of pieces of steel and trying to arrange and compose them into something significant, which I had no prior idea because I don't draw to prepare for the work. I don't prepare by drawing. I'm sure there's thinking in there that, automatically affects what you try to do. But as playing with form, experimenting with form, things come together in my own thinking. There's no outside references because I'm not trying to work like anybody else in that sense. But anyway, as things become clear, if one part becomes clear, then what goes to it in addition. And often after having worked half a day and getting something, and the judgment of it is, well, this is okay, or it's headed towards something. Or if it's not, I take the torches and cut it up and start all over again. It's a perennial attempt to make something that I feel is coherent. And all of my knowledge or history is potentially available, but it is just a small thing because I was working small scale because At small scale, you can experiment with a lot of ideas. It's kind of like, if you will, shorter musical compositions, you know. I always liked and listened to a lot of music, and any number of things from Charlie Parker, Duke Ellington, or that kind of things. Well, all the records in that period were 3 minutes or so, and but they were coherent, significant compositions. Other kinds of music, because I listened to all kind in the period, would have been very modernist Western music, like Anton Webern, or, you know, or 19th century, you know, any kind of music, really.
Right.
And a couple of my schoolmates were very interested in music, so we argued about what was good, what was bad, what was interesting. I'd play at Thelonious Monk, and they'd say, well, he's not as accurate, and it's clear that he's been listening to Bach. Well, yeah, there's a lot of Bach out there, but anybody ever took a music lesson probably had some, but that didn't mean, you know, but when you know how unique the music of Thelonious Monk is in any musical system of comparison, I was trying to be as, hopefully trying to be as inventive as any of those people, you know. And
I
naturally, other visual artists, I knew their history and, you know, that kind of thing, but that was a part of my realm.
And I think the small size, especially of these first works, is really in a period of the late 50s and early 60s where so many artists were expanding and making things larger and larger. These are small scale, but they don't feel small. They're incredibly compressed and very dense objects.
I hope they would be strong.
Yeah,
you know, visually,
exactly.
yeah. And, you know, the biggest athlete is not necessarily the strongest or best athlete. You know, well, the biggest, the largest sculpture, the largest painting, is not necessarily the best. And even if it is, you know, if we look at art, you see there are masterpieces that are this size, and there are masterpieces that are mural scale. And I did pay attention to size. I liked very much the innovations of the Mexican muralist, Orozco Siqueiros, you know, and Rivera. And if you're in Southern California or the Southwest, that was often, you know, presented to you in your student years. And I did, by 63, I had been to Mexico looking at things. And I had seen the examples that were on the West Coast, you know. I was aware of the history of sculpture and art, but I wasn't that concerned about what other people did unless I thought something might help me in what they did. I found the most informative thing from other sculptors was how they set up their studios or prepared, you know, to work and stuff. Naturally, I paid attention to what they looked like because, you know, what something looks like is what we judge in terms of art. But for my own reference, truthfully, I needed more. I knew less about how to set up a place for a sculptor to work than I did about having ideas of what to do. So,
And when you started making these small-scale reliefs, at what point did you realize you had something that was like an ongoing, a series or conversation between objects, and why did you decide to call them as a group Lynch Fragments?
Yeah. After the very first piece, I knew that I was on to something that would mean something to me in developing work. And they'd be small, they'd be dynamic, and all of that. They had no titles. Titles don't come before the work. You know, it's like, I'll use my perennial example, and I think everybody in here will understand it. You don't pick out a name and then start trying to make a baby. You start having fun, and then later on somebody says, and you start thinking about naming, you know. So a part of the evolution of the name part of the work is that way. Some Bright Morning's title came after the work was finished, but felt appropriate to what I felt was going on in the piece. And then the other pieces there, Ace, which was really, I liked that fact that there was a nickname of a schoolmate. That's what we called him, but it was a reference to the fact that if you played an ace in playing cards, that was the highest card on the table, so to speak. I wasn't much of a card player, so I didn't use many other titles from playing cards.
You took the top one and stayed
There you
with that.
go. There you go. I guess I still have deuce and trade, but to work with. But and the other one, Afro Phoenix, that really referenced my interest in history and African history in particular, and in the social predicament of African peoples, and that the redevelopment and resurgence of our histories and culture, and so that was why that title. The collective title, the Lynch Fragments, for the group of things, came sort of in that same period, but after there was a group of works. I realized I was going to be doing more things in that direction, and I didn't want them discussed in the traditional ways of the modern art world, and it's what we call formalist criticism. That is somebody's idea of, well, only what you see is what there is, because nothing in life is really like that. There's always more to anything than what you see, and I like the idea of playing with symbols and the thoughts people might have and might not. And the titles were meant to be provocative, and to name names. When I heard that there was a particular influential art historian named Clement Greenberg, who sort of seemed to affect a lot of people with that kind of idea, and I just frankly felt, well, that's his idea, but it's not truthfully accurate. Human beings make art for any reason they want. People deal with implications as much as they do, If you want to say it another way, the silence between sounds is just as important as the sounds themselves, or the notes, if you will. Or the spaces that we call negative space in visual art is just as important as the forms that create the space's visual appearance. And in other words, you play with both what you can see and what you can't see, what you know and what you don't know. And it was clear to anybody that saw my work early on in those years that I was dealing with the racial history and dynamics that was present in the United States and the world. And I intended to use it within the dynamics of my work,
What kinds of associations or thoughts, what did that title Lynch Fragments mean in your artistic thinking? Yeah.
Well, in the sense...
Because it's a title you've kept for the series up to the present day, basically.
Well, there was no reason to change it in the first place, because the truth is the dynamics that existed in the world still exist in their various forms. But and so I had no notion. A couple of people said, well, if you'd name them abstraction A, B, and C, your work would be more popular, or this or that. And I said, well, I never was working for popularity. That's I tended to not to bother the people who have musical aspirations, but that felt more a part of the entertainment world. Although even though Picasso said painting was entertainment too, but I had my own take. In other words, I liked the idea of strength and making serious statements, and I wanted people, if they would take the time to, if the words were strange to them, look them up. If it's the name of a place like Harare, and you don't know what that is, well, look up Harare, and you see it has a history. It was Salisbury, Rhodesia, that place has changed, and and if you're paying attention, that they've developed a significant contemporary art movement that's focused in stone. But if you never look up the word, and you just pay attention to the collective title, well, you miss out, you know. And some pieces are, there's one called Mojo for 1404. That's our family address in Houston.
1404, right.
1404 Wayne Street, and that's where Coco lived. The piece that's upstairs, the painted rocker piece that's kinetic. That piece has my grandmother's name,
Yes.
not because of any image of grandma in the rocking chair, that you hardly didn't see, but my childhood playing with that rocking chair, it turning over, I had a stick in my mouth, I ended up in the hospital. Now that's way before I knew anything about Alexander Calder or Jacques Tingley or other people who might work with modern art. But when I did decide that I had an interest in kinetic ideas and sculpture, and I was familiar with Tingley because I had worked preparing his work, so I knew how that worked, but that was motors. I wasn't interested in that. And I always wanted to have, if you will, my own voice. And so I wouldn't make something that was like a Calder, although I like Calder's work very much, Sometimes you have to be careful about things that you like so much because they cause imitation. And when you're trying to search for something for yourself, it's more important that you find your own way, And I always felt that. So when I kind of got a little reputation as a person who knew how to repair kinetic sculpture, so I did Tingley's and the opposite form in kinetic sculpture, which is very simple, Paul Bury. And when I got asked a couple more times, I said, well, I don't do that anymore. But at the same time, I started to develop my own interest, and that's where the concept of rocking came, the idea of balance. In other words, they rock, but the principle is always related to balance. So for the piece Coco, it's symmetrical. However, the chains that go from side to side in it means that when it is taken off balance or rocked, if you will, the chains, because they're flexible, the gravity of them lags behind the movement of the steel frame, so that the chains are a little behind and shake a bit, so they sort of syncopate the rocking motion of the Coco.
And I should add, because this is an incredible sight to see this thing rocking, but it's also a gigantic and very heavy couple pieces of steel that can harm toes and feet. So we're not going to be able to let other people rock it, but we have filmed Melvin rocking it yesterday, and I think we're going to be posting that to our website very soon. One thing I did not expect is when you rock this is that it's not only syncopated in the way you're talking about, but it's also kind of shimmying. It's shimmies.
Well, shimmying is syncopation.
That's right, but it's the other direction. That's right.
Yeah. Well, it was first shown at the Whitney Museum in New York, and they asked me, should people be allowed to rock it? And they caught a man rocking his wife in there, so they didn't permit that anymore. What can I say? Sometimes people are more inventive than the sculptors,
Well, you've brought up, this connection, syncopation, with what you were talking about a little bit earlier, your interest in music. And I wanted to just go back to another early work, this one, Inside and Out, which you've talked with me before about the role of space in this work, because it's also very strong work, but it's also, as the title suggests, it's got some interior space, or what some people would call negative space.
Sure. Well, that all of that's a natural part of sculpture. When I was aware that I was making a serious attempt to change from painting to sculpture, I spent a couple of days writing out the qualities of painting and what the differences would be between that and sculpture. basically it was, of course, sculpture is 3 dimensions, but the 3 dimensions are not just the space of the piece within the piece itself, but the space of the environment in which it's in, because you feel and anticipate things based. We all walk through doorways and we want to make sure we don't bump the door or we don't do that. That's a sculptural awareness or a 3-dimensional awareness that's normal to human experience, not particularly profound. You could say there's a Texas metaphor, if you will, okay? I think it came from Lyndon Johnson, but he can't walk and chew gum at the same time. Well, that actually is an interpretation of a set of activities. Chewing is one thing, walking is another. They're all part of a human being or a form, but they actually mean that if you evaluate them, there are different things to consider. In terms of sculpture, inside and outside of a particular work or the forms. And up to this work, probably was, 6th or 7th in the development of the Lynch Fragments, I realized I had been making things that were pretty compressed, if you will. And it seemed interesting to make something that was more open, but it had, in a sense, the same elements that I played with, little pieces of chain, forms and things like that, but it was more open. And truthfully, it felt a bit more like architecture, which I already had an interest in. So the inside and the outside within the work was important. And some of the later pieces that are much larger really exploit, or I try to exploit or explore those kind of ideas. They don't necessarily look like that one, but that's what's going on.
That's one thing that makes me think that we have only what we have out here in the lower level gallery is you can tell much better when you go out and look at it. These are black and white photographs of from the Whitney's 1970 show that Melvin did there of these barbed wire pieces, and you're talking about inside and outside. I think it's really strong in these works as well, because especially the curtain for William and Peter, it's very hard to tell which side of the curtain one can be on. I've seen photographs where there are people on either side of the curtain talking to each other. And it's very striking to me, especially with barbed wire, that it very much matters which side you're on, whether you're keeping something out or keeping something in.
Okay, the first time that I showed an example of the curtain would have been October 1969 at a gallery at Stony Brook State University in New York. And the director of the gallery was the art historian Lawrence Alloway, and he'd been convinced that we should do this exhibition. It happened to be a room similar to this in size, but typical in universities. It had a area down the center where they could run an artificial division of the room, and they could have two, class over here, class over there. And when I saw the space, I said, that'd be a good place for my curtain idea. And so I put up the screw hoops, and as it was starting to get clear to him that you weren't going to be able to go from one side of the room to the other, and there were paintings on the wall on both sides, that meant I may have messed up the opportunity to see the paintings in the right way. And I was up on a ladder with the barbed wire, and we had this argument. And he said, look, you got your barbed wire, you got your chain, you made your symbolic impression, but we need so people can go from one side to the other. And I said, well, if you'll remember, there's a door over here and a door over there, and all they got to do is walk around, and that's a part of the three-dimensional experience, So, I kind of think I'm a little bit smart about this stuff. I admit that. I kind of know what I'm talking about, But anyway, and he didn't like that, and then he walked away. And then he came back 5 minutes later. He said, okay, I really do understand. I wasn't considering what you're you know, what you're considering with it. Because it was all about the work. It wasn't about the argument between us, you know, because that's how we learn things from each other, you know, the considerations that those who make art and those who present it have things to consider, and they come from their points of view. But I always like to say, if it's going to be the art of a person or the music of a composer, it starts with them. The language is their invention. So let's see what that's like. If we do that, then, you know, we have a better chance of advancing things, you know. It's not ego. I mean, it's just that that's the order of things in creating or transmitting and receiving information, you know.
Yeah, you made these works and also the curtain, the first version of the curtain, shortly after moving to New York from Los Angeles.
Roughly, yeah, a couple years.
Like 67 is when you moved. And when you moved, you decided at that point to stop making Lynch Fragments for
the reason that I had plenty of other kinds of ideas, both having to do with size, having to do with form possibilities that extended more into space. I already had done some versions, but excuse me, I hadn't concentrated on those kind of ideas. And I had ideas related to architecture, geometry, and stuff like that. I didn't then, and I don't now consider my knowledge of geometry or architecture profound, but I have enough curiosity, and just through experimenting, find things that are unusual for me, you know. And I think in that sense, I'm not unique. A lot of our artists work that way. They find things and then they further the experiment, you know. So.
You did return to, well, let's see. Well, I seem to be stuck. We're stuck in the barbed wire. There it is. You returned, the first time you returned to the Lynch Fragments, you were in New York. And in '73, you made a small group of them, like the one on the left, Nam, named after Vietnam. But you also made the one on the right, Coco, which is on the poster for our talk. You went to Africa for the first time in 1970.
That's right.
And by this time, you had already gone back another couple of times. And that's been... Since then, I mean, we always talk, people tend to talk about the early years of an artist's life, but it seems to me like Africa and traveling there has been like as hugely important, as you know, your roots in Texas, your time in Los Angeles, and I mean, it's a big continent and a big subject. But do you want to?
It's a big world, you know, in the first place, but. In my case, typical of a lot of people in the general African-American communities in the Western Hemisphere, given the historical ways that we came, a lot of the direct relations were cut or prevented. And that period of the 50s and 60s, the independence struggles in various countries, seeing people like Tom Mboya of Kenya on American television in the 50s, understanding that as we were fighting civil rights struggles here, they were fighting for their independences there. They made sense. In art terms, a part of everybody's modern art. Excuse me.
Yeah, would you like some?
A part of everybody's art education would mention that contemporary art or modern art, primarily through Picasso and various artists in France in the period, was influenced by Africa. And so that was a valid resource for using in your work. Cubism and other ideas evolved in part through that kind of awareness. As I said, I always liked history and reading about things. So what I got in the art departments wasn't all. And the studies of history said that, well, Picasso's sculpture and its African interests reflected only one region and primarily one country, and that's Gabon. Had nothing to do with Benin, had nothing to do with Congo, had nothing to do with any other cultures. And what that meant was the availability of images of African art came directly through the trade routes. In other words, whatever other goods they were bringing and getting from Gabon, the art came to France that way. So he saw it in France because the work from Gabon didn't go to England. It went to France, And if you really study the stuff, you start to find out that, it isn't African art comprehensively that influenced it through him and them, but it really is the art of the region of Gabon, and they have particular interest. And I don't mean that there's anything wrong with that, but it's just the fact that my name is Edwards, and I know that's a Welsh name. And I don't think anybody has looked up here and thought they saw a Welshman. Although I hear royalty is visiting. But what I'm getting at, is there are realities to the histories that we learn, and sometimes it's not very complete. But there was enough of it that it helped Picasso and those who were making changes. When I went to Africa in 1970 through an organization called Educators to Africa, and it was a tour of 130 people, primarily teachers, and we were in 4 countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Togo, and Dahomey. Dahomey has since changed its name to the People's Republic of Benin, but these were 4 countries next to each other, 2 of which had English language as their national governmental languages, and 2 which used French. We spent most time in the English-speaking countries. It was a great trip for me and for everybody involved. But for me, I met artists, I met architects, I met teachers, I met fishermen. There was a day in a fishing village named Biriwa, which is a Fante village in Ghana. And they gave us rides out in fishing boats, which meant there were canoes about as wide as this platform with about 12 paddlers, 6 on each side, usually young men. And my wife and I were seated in the front and a couple of others in the back. And the paddlers were, very infatuated because here's a pretty lady up in the paddle, and she's from somewhere else, and they don't have their eyes on what they're doing, and one of them dropped his paddle. Now, we're out in the ocean. You talk about an embarrassed man, because he had to dive off in the ocean. They had to bring the boat around. He got his paddle and came back in, and he was just an embarrassed person. But when we were back in the village itself, one of the religious women of the village came to her and wanted her picture taken, with her, and she wanted her hand to be on Jane because she felt she was it was a meaningful thing, her being there, and things like that happen. Now, what does that do to your work as an artist? Well, it depends on the person and how you feel about it. But I think that any experience anywhere with people who have other cultural things developed and they're coherent, they had bronze casters, they had gold casters, fishermen and farmers. So there was expertise in everything that makes the world go round. And here it was in a place that believe me, most of the information that I had earlier didn't necessarily give you that information. And that just kept being confirmed. And I met an architect, artist of my age group, and we discussed with he and his friends, well, what's the future for us? What are we trying to do? And people often ask me, well, are you influenced by African art? I find not so much influence as corroboration of interest. That is, how to make a better world. They were concerned about that. And that same man that I'm speaking of, Damison Woko, he'll have his 80th birthday this year. He has a wonderful history of having produced unique architecture, referencing the past, but very strongly related, not just related, but affected by the principles of earlier architecture. And yet it can contemporarily handle any kind of technology and that sort of thing. And we're in touch to this day. There's a couple of major books on his architecture. And he's one of those that said, no, he's not going to go in Europe because he was often invited. I mean, he went, but he wasn't going to develop a career outside of Africa. He wanted to develop things there, you know. And I worked with him, did work with some of his metal workers. There's one small Lynch fragment kind of work, because the first thing that he worked on that he asked me to do something for was a chapel, a Dominican chapel seminary complex in Ibadan, Nigeria. So I made a small, apparently Lynch fragment kind of sculpture, but it had cross and implications of Christianity. What other people wouldn't know is that the cross already was there in traditional Igbo culture, which is a part of what he comes from, and not as a symbol of Christianity, but for other reasons of their own. And the second time I came, the next year, he had completed a couple of buildings, and he wanted me to see one in particular. And there were stained glass windows in it. And when he took inside, and when I could see it from inside, I started to smile and then laugh. And he says, you know what I did? I said, yeah, I know. I say, you know, everybody who sees it in the Western world thinks you're got a wall full of crosses. And I said, that's an Igbo mask if I ever saw one. You know. But what it meant was that visual ideas have always moved around historically, and people don't necessarily, they aren't always aware of it. We don't always know meaning. We just, we like something or we don't like it. We appreciate it or we don't appreciate it. But the point is that was a part of his idea of modernizing in that world. And that idea of very much impressed me. And through the years, various people that I've met, some as comprehensive as he and others not so, but that's the way life is. Yeah.
Well, and we could, and I would want to go on, but I'm also thinking I'd really like, I've been enormously privileged, and I'm very grateful for all the time that we've spent together working on this show, and this is one of many conversations along these lines that we have had. We didn't manage to make it back to football, but we talked about football in one of our conversations that's published. There are conversations with him published on our website, and we talk about football. But what I think I'd really like to do is give some of you a chance to ask him some questions. If Mel, would you like to?
No, I don't want to.
No, okay.
Of course, I'll take questions.
I know, we do. I know you would. But please, if any of you have some questions, we'd be happy to entertain them. Melvin. Get in the striped shirt.
How did you get to work with Tingley, or with his sculpture?
Yeah, I didn't work with him. He had made a group of pieces with Dwan Gallery in Los Angeles. I think he had made them in the summer of '65. And my neighbor worked for Dwan Gallery. And Tingley had made the works, but he hadn't completed them in the sense of attaching the motors and completing the chain connections that might make sections move. And my neighbor told John Weber, who was the director of Dwan Gallery at the time, that I might be able to do something with it. The truth is, I'm not a sophisticated person when it comes to mechanics, and you don't call me to do anything that has to do with your automobile or anything like that. But my great ability as a 12-year-old fixing my bicycle was enough to work with Tingley, believe it or not. Meaning, I knew if a thing went from here to there and it was supposed to fit in the sprockets and move something. And he'd already bought the switches, electrical switches that you step on that would make the motors, come on or off. And luckily for me, they were the same switches that I remembered my mother had for her electric sewing machine. And she had taught me how to sew in a limited manner because as a small boy, like small boys are a problem. So, okay, here, let me show you how to do this. And it was World War II, and she taught me how to make a rectangular thing of two pieces of cloth that looked kind of like a soldier's hat, So I could salute, but it was flowered. It was flowered. It wasn't. I didn't look too militaristic. But the point is, I remembered how to step on the pedal. So when I got to Tingley, I knew if I attached them and and things. In short, I made the exhibition work. There were about 20 pieces. There's an old photograph I'm still looking for of one of my daughters who was a year and a half old, and I let her play with one because she was mesmerized that you could step on this thing and these stuff would move like that. But that's the sensibility that Tingley was developing for everybody. He made them larger, smaller. He had those that had to do with sound and radio and that kind of thing. And anyway, we did that. When I came to New York, an exhibition of Tingley's work was going to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And I took on the task of going there and making sure that things worked. And as I said earlier, then people thought I could do a lot with that. But the Tingley story, it goes basically that way.
Are there other questions?
Yeah, something like that.
How did slavery inform your work? And also, what are your new ideas for new works?
Slavery directly, other people, I don't think I've ever written that down, okay? But slavery is a part of the historical 500 years of oppression that African peoples have gone through. Every time anybody sees a piece of chain that has some of that history, that psychologically is there, So I'm trying to remember something that's very directly related to slavery. And I don't think I have a title that ever says that. I don't mean that it's not there. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is slavery is only a part of the whole corpus of oppression that's gone on in the last 500 years. It legally existed. The United States legally came into being in 1776, and slavery ended less than 100 years later in 1865. But the consequences of the activity had international repercussions and still exist to this day. If you'd asked that question of one of my Nigerian friends, he would say, well, we didn't have what you call slavery, we just had colonialism. See, slavery and colonialism are human activities that create profit for people. Slavery wouldn't have existed 5 minutes if it hadn't been profitable. It's as simple as that. So then exploiting people for profit is there. You say, how does that affect my work? Well, I'm aware of that. As one of my granduncles said when he wanted to explain slavery, because his father was born in the time of slavery, he said, you think slavery is over, don't you? This was a conversation in 1979. I had never met him. He lived in Detroit. And I said, well, Uncle Charlie, we both know that legally it's over, so just tell me what you mean. He said, you got a credit card? Well, 25% interest would have been good for any plantation. In other words, if you think of the structure of things, what the structure of slavery is, then as far as within my work, yes, I use chains and symbolically. So, but again, the word chain and what it is. I live in upstate New York. You read about the 2 feet of snow that's up there when I go back. Any number of times my car has been off the road, and I've been very happy to see the truck with chains coming and pulling me out. So it's not the chain, it's the situation, And if I can be a little more blunt about the history of slavery, most slaves never wore a chain. But the conditions of that life and that existence, that's what kept people oppressed, And, it existed way before racial slavery, because serfdom and the structure of English land ownership, people went with the land, And, consequences of human structures still exist. So if you want to say, how does that fit with me as a sculptor? Well, I'm very aware of what structure, the importance of structure. So a piece of mine like Chano, which was invented to attach to the wall, the floor, and the ceiling, when I don't have wall, floor, ceiling to attach to, I construct a structure which can then suspend that piece, In other words, if you change your understanding, or if your environment changes, human beings usually make adaptations. And visual artists do that all the time. So slavery, that's very much a part of it. But, I lived here since 1937. I'm 77. And we've had and do still have a lot to work on that's just as oppressive as slavery. There probably are more people, African American, in prisons today because we don't educate people from the Head Start level in age than there were people in slavery in Texas in the 10 years that Texas was a part of the United States before emancipation. I presume you can gather I'm very interested in history and its details. But, that's a part of trying to know and develop something in my work, and the perennial hope that other people and the generations that are following us will have an improved world when we leave it, and they will leave an improved world when they leave it.
Let's take one more question.
There's one back there.
Okay. I don't know who you pointed out, but
It's back there.
okay.
Stand up and say something.
This is maybe a less interesting historical question, but I appreciated your comment about formalism and Clement Greenberg and your distancing of your work from that, and saying that you were more interested in social and political questions. But by the same token, when we look at your work, you might say that it's not particularly didactic, say. That there are ways in which it is kind of formalist and modernist, perhaps. And so particularly if we think about it in the 1960s and compare it to something like pop art or conceptual art or the Black Arts movement, lots of the things that ended up as murals and other kinds of more didactic work. So I'm wondering, is there anything you can say about the value of that formalist modernist history?
Yeah. No, I never said I didn't value those principles, but what I didn't and what I objected to was the idea that they were the only aspects of the principles by which we make art that we should focus our work on. I didn't think Greenberg or anybody else, I used him because most people know of that. The truth is, for myself anyway, I was on the West Coast, and you know, we didn't have cell phones, and information didn't move very quickly from east to west. And that was more important to people in New York than they were to me. I was just a young independent artist in his studio on Vernon and Van Ness in Los Angeles. And I didn't care what Greenberg or anybody else thought. I just wanted to be able to fully express what I was trying to express. As far as the value of various ways and means of other artists, no, I think they're all valid. I never thought his was invalid. It just wasn't going to be there as something that would put limits on what I was trying to do. And I happen to think that at least to me, the most important development in the early 20th century, when art in the Western world changed a great deal, was that you were free to imagine and invent your own approaches to things and then your own solutions and development of those ideas. And I think history has pretty much borne that out. So all of those styles, approaches, etc., that you mentioned, they're all valid, you know. But so is my approach, and I'm going to be egoistic enough to say, well, there's a whole lot of people here that think maybe what I thought made some sense. You know, at least there's a whole room full of stuff, and you know, in 5 decades, you know, and I never had a drink with Clement Greenberg because he wasn't one of my drinking buddies, but he did drink, as I understand it, with David Smith, and of course I respect Smith's work, you know. So my expression in relation to those things was that's what helped me to evolve what I was interested in. And most of the artists that I respect had their own approaches to things. Greenberg didn't like George Sugarman, who was a beautifully strong, abstract sculptor, had none of the social stuff that I had in mind. And George and I appreciated each other's approach very easily. I didn't have problems with other artists, you know. And I like to say in relation, excuse me, art historians, curators, etc.
Go for it.
But it comes from the inventors first, and then others evaluate it. And that's fine, you know, that's fine. My music is mine, and you get to hear it. And if you don't want it, turn it off.
Thank you, Melvin.
Thank you.
All right, I think there are drinks, I think, out there, and I think thank you all for coming so much, and for coming to the exhibition, which you have several more months to enjoy as well. Thanks.
Very good. Very good.